February 20th, 1944. Central Germany, 12:11 hours. The cold is a clean blade and the light is winter sharp. Frost lies in thin curls along the edges of a grass dispersal strip cut into dark earth. A bicycle clatters past a line of camouflage fighters, its chain ticking like a metronome. Far beyond the tree line, a new sound blooms. First a rumor, then a pressure across the chest. The low, layered thunder of many engines. Not one voice, but a chorus. The sky is pricked by white runes as contrails ladder toward the zenith and stitch the horizon into a grid. A ground crewman looks up and does what men across Europe have learned to do when the air itself begins to carry weight. He counts, 4s and 8s, and then numbers too large to hold in a mind trained on scarcity. Somewhere an officer's pencil slows over a map. Somewhere else, hundreds of miles away, a factory whistle blows to mark the change of shift. That whistle, thin and practical, is a sound most men at this field will never hear. But it is their weather now, an unbroken schedule turned into movement across an ocean. The promise of the arsenal of democracy, words spoken in a radio address 3 winters ago, has taken shape in aluminum, gasoline, oil, and hope hammered into procedure. By late winter 1944, the air war over Germany has moved past a test of skill and into a test of systems, and every system has a noise. The Luftwaffe's is the wing whistle of a Bf-109 or the iron clatter of an FW-190 at full boost. The American system sings differently, the industrial cadence of rivet guns, the hiss of pneumatic lines, the heartbeat of radial engines, and above it all, the factory shift whistle that divides a day into yields. To understand why this morning matters, it is necessary to travel backward and outward at once. In 1942 and through mid-1943, the Luftwaffe had reason to believe that daylight bombing raids over Germany could be blunted with courage and tactics. The Reich Air Defense, Reichsverteidigung, was organized around experienced fighter wings, well-placed flak, radar-directed interceptions, and the belief that a determined and agile defense could bleed bomber formations until policy changed. The defense came close to proving itself on terrible days. On October 14, 1943, the 2nd Schweinfurt mission, the day later called Black Thursday, saw the 8th Air Force send 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses toward the ball-bearing works. 60 bombers did not come back. Many more were so damaged they would never fly again. Casualties approached 600 airmen. German pilots wrote in their combat logs that day in language shaped by exhaustion and victory. The pattern seemed set, fatal to the attackers, survivable for the defenders. But war is never one pattern. In the months that followed, production lines in America that had been learning to walk learned to run. The B-24 Liberator plant at Willow Run, built by Ford Motor Company on a marshy expanse in Michigan, shook out its kinks, solved its defects, and discovered the tempo that had been promised when the plant was laid out like an idea of the future. By 1944, a B-24 rolled off its mile-long line on average about once every hour, sometimes 63 minutes, sometimes faster, an astonishing rate for a machine so large that it could cast a town square into shade. "We will turn out 1 bomber an hour," Ford's production chief Charles Sorensen had said before the line found its feet. The sentence read like a boast when paper was cheap and the machines were not yet real. In 1944, it became a schedule. Other factories, Consolidated at San Diego and Fort Worth, Douglas at Tulsa, North American in Dallas, joined in. The final tally of B-24s would cross 18,000. Boeing's B-17 would exceed 12,700. The B-25 Mitchell and B-26 Marauder, mediums with precise purposes, numbered in the many thousands. Later, the B-29 would appear, a pressurized promise of distance. The United States Army Air Forces counted aircraft in ways that gave planners confidence in enemies' dread. 85,000 aircraft produced in 1943, alone across all types, and then more than 96,000 in 1944. Heavy bombers, the class that cut contrails across this February sky, flowed in numbers that could not be explained by courage alone. Expectation for the men who would intercept those formations had been set by the years 1940 to 1943. When an alarm bell sounded along the Kamm-Huber line and the plots merged into a course line, a Jagdgeschwader could swing up to meet the threat with the belief that skill at gunnery, disciplined formations, and concentrated attacks would peel bombers from their boxes. The FW-190A and BF-109G were exact tools at low and medium altitude. Armament tailored to kill, twin 13mm machine guns and 20mm cannons. Later, 30mm Mk-108s, whose heavy shells could shatter a bomber with 2 or 3 strikes if delivered from close range. Sturmgruppen, assault groups with armored FW-190A 8/R2 and R8 variants, were formed to bore into the tight bomber formations and finish with ramming if ammunition ran out. Tactics adapted in spirals, frontal attacks at closing speeds above 600 miles per hour to collapse bomber fire lanes, or stern approaches into the wind. If the day was right and the timing perfect, an attack section could move along a bomber box and mark a line of flame across the sky. Reality changed in the space between a sentence and a schedule. Through late 1943 and into 1944, American escorts lengthened their reach. First came Thunderbolts with drop tanks and pilots who had learned that altitude and energy could outrun almost any fineness at low speed. Then arrived the P-51 Mustang in numbers, long-legged and lethal, the escort that set out from England and stayed with the bomber stream to the target and back again. The men who had learned to wait until the escorts turned for home now found themselves harried all the way. The days of unescorted heavies over central Germany shrank and then ended. A line widely attributed after the war to Hermann Göring, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost," compresses the experience into a single phrase. Underneath that sentence lay months of attrition and adjustment. The bomber stream did not thin on schedule. It thickened. The record of that thickening is written in numbers that seem almost uninterested in their own implications. On many days in 1944 and early 1945, more than 1,000 American heavy bombers took off from English airfields. On April 7, 1945, the 8th Air Force dispatched over 1,200. Bomber divisions organized into combat wings, and groups filled the air in long, structural arcs. Fighter Command and 8th Fighter Command integrated with radar in plotting to place escorts along the routes. And when radar and weather failed, doctrine and plenty filled in the gaps. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey would write in cool post-war prose that the Allies possessed overwhelming superiority and war potential, and that the air offensive was the decisive factor in breaking the German economy. The words contain maps and factories within them. They contain a whistle and a line where bombers emerge into morning light in ever-growing columns. German airmen felt the turning in their bodies. Diaries and unit histories from Jagdgeschwader 2, 26, 27, 54, and others describe the exhaustion that comes when every day brings another climb to 7,000 meters and a choice between attacking escorts or bombing formations. Oil stained their gloves and cold needled their fingers. Fuel scarcity made training a whisper of what it had been in 1940 to 1941, where the Luftwaffe had trained pilots with 200 to 240 flight hours in the early war years. By 1944, many replacements arrived with about 110 hours. In 1945, some with half that. The reasons were not mysterious. Fuel production had been cut to pieces by raids against hydrogenation plants at Leuna, Merseburg, Pölitz, Gelsenkirchen, and other nodes. Synthetic fuel output fell from hundreds of thousands of tons per month to a fraction. A fighter without fuel, wrote Albert Speer after the war, is a training accident disguised as a strategy. He admitted in his memoirs that the war had been determined by production, a sentence that angered men who had risked everything in the cockpit, but which pointed to a truth they had felt. If this sounds like the literature of despair, it should not. The men who defended their cities did so with a ferocity recorded in photographs of black puffs over familiar streets and in the fragments of flight logs and claims that perform their own dance of revision as wars end. Heavy bomber loss rates in 1943 without escort could reach catastrophic heights. By 1944, with full escort, losses could fall below 1 or 2% on some missions and into the high single digits on the worst. In between lay terrible days. March 6, 1944, Berlin attacked with severe losses. April, missions against aircraft factories and rail yards. June, across Normandy's hedgerows. Autumn, above oil. Big week, Operation Argument, February 20th to 25th, 1944. The very week this morning opens. Through thousands of sorties at German aircraft production and assembly nodes. The industry staggered. More importantly, for the men at the sharp end, the fighter arm bled experienced leaders it could not easily replace. There's an emotional truth the records rarely catch, bound as they are to precision. German aces and squadron leaders expected to face formations they could count and cut apart. They expected ambushes, frontal attacks, and the grim arithmetic of men who knew their trade. But what they met instead was multiplication. Each time they looked up, the contrails had thickened. Ladders added rungs faster than they could fall. Knocked down 10 and 100 more appeared. Knocked down 100, and the next week the sky looked unchanged. The mind rejects that kind of math until it can't. Belief turns to knowledge, and knowledge to fatigue, the kind that settles into the eyes and shoulders. Across the ocean, the story looked different. A bomber every hour wasn't a slogan, it was a process. Willow Run's 3.5 million square feet of concrete and steel curved like an argument settled by machinery. The line bent so completed B-24s could roll straight onto the runway. Wings, tails, and fuselage sections arrived from a web of suppliers. Men and women in overalls worked shoulder to shoulder, repeating motions until speed became precision. Perfection learned to move quickly, taught by scrap, sweat, and retooling. By mid-1944, as the summer heat shimmered over Michigan, Willow Run had found its rhythm. Rivet guns rattled like rain, the whistle marked time, and production became a heartbeat that accountants translated into squadrons. Ford's line alone produced over 8,600 B-24s. Across the program, more than 18,000. Transformation in war is often silent. It is a change in what people think is possible. In 1943, many in the Luftwaffe believed that existing doctrine, applied bravely, could check the daylight offensive, at least until political will bent. In 1944, that belief crumbled under evidence. Tactics adapted to extremes. Sturmgruppen forced their way into the bomber boxes and left terrible wakes. Consider the July 7, 1944 attack near Oschersleben, when concentrated F-1W-190s tore through a division of B-24s with heavy loss to both sides. But exceptions became punctuations, not new grammar. The hope that a jet, Me-2 6-2, could reverse the trend arrived with wings that were quick and delicate and hungry for fuel. Leadership disagreements over its role as bomber or interceptor, shortages of materials, raids on production, and the delaying friction of the real guaranteed that the jet would be an epilogue to a decision already made. Stand finally in a museum hangar where a B-24 rests in bright quiet. Its rivets catch a sun shaft. The bomber's immense wing seems to sag with memory. There is no scent of oil now, no stain of cordite. Children lift their heads and stare at a thing that must have felt inevitable when it was common and feels impossible now that it is rare. Listen carefully. In the stillness, you can almost hear it, the faint practical note of a shift whistle carried on an air that is not war's air. It sounds like a factory's door opening. It sounds like work beginning. It sounds like what freedom looks like when it becomes a schedule, a bomber every hour, an idea made into metal, a promise fulfilled by many hands and divided by a clock so that none of those hands must bear the whole weight alone.